everyone to the second Tutorful Talks session. I'm Luke, so I'm going to be hosting this evening. I work at Tutorful in the customer success team. And I'm pleased to introduce, we've got Dylan here, who's going to be doing a talk today about vaccines and of course the effect they've had. I'll kind of pass over to you now, if that's all right, Dylan, for you to introduce yourself.
All right. Okay, then. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming, and thank you for having me to Tutorful as well. So as mentioned, we'll just open up this slideshow and then we'll get on with it. Okay. Okay then, so today we'll be talking all about COVID-19 and the vaccinations that are available for it. Now, naturally, COVID-19 doesn't need much of an introduction. It's made itself very well known over the past year, especially. The vaccines that have been developed in response to it, some of them perhaps we don't know quite so much about just yet. Some of them are very new. Some of them are using groundbreaking technology. And so we're going to be having a bit of a chat about them today so that we can, basically just so that we can know what's what. So yeah, just before we get straight into it, my name's Dylan. I'm a scientist, a biologist specifically. So this is not my direct area of expertise in my own research in the past, but very closely related to it. Okay then, so one of the first things that I've heard that can confuse people is the different names for the things available here. So we've all heard of coronavirus, COVID-19, and maybe SARS-CoV-2, a little more unusually. Now, although these three things are used sometimes interchangeably, and I may well end up doing that myself in here, they do technically mean different things. So coronavirus, this refers to a group of viruses, basically a class of virus. There are many different types of coronaviruses, and there are many different types of viruses besides coronaviruses. SARS-CoV-2, this is the specific coronavirus, almost like a species of coronavirus, which causes COVID-19. And then, of course, COVID-19, this is the disease itself. So SARS-CoV-2, a type of coronavirus that causes COVID-19, to put them all together in a sentence. Okay then, so what is a virus basically? Now, in an everyday sense, we probably think of viruses as pretty much interchangeably with bacteria and other bugs like that. And as far as we're concerned, when we go to the doctor, a lot of the time that may well be true. However, from a technical perspective, viruses and bacteria are quite different things. So we'll have a look at exactly what viruses are before we focus too much on the COVID one. So a bacteria, on the one hand, this is a living thing. It's a living cell. So it needs nutrition, it divides to make more bacteria, things like that. It's a fairly complex structure compared to a virus. A virus, on the other hand, this is basically just a package of DNA or RNA, which is very similar. We'll come back to that a little later on. Viruses, there's really not an awful lot to them besides this genetic material and a shell around them. As a result of this, viruses can't actually do anything themselves, really. They can get themselves inside the cell, and then they have to rely on, living cells in order to do everything that the virus, let's say, wants to do. So in order to do this, like we say, they have to get their DNA or their RNA into a cell. And this is how it infects people, how it makes people ill, that sort of thing. So let's say that we have a single cell here. The virus lands on it, and this then injects its DNA or its RNA, basically its genetic material, whichever the specific virus has, and puts it inside the cell. The cell, then this reads the genetic material, and it does what cells always do with genes. They make more copies of them, and they do what the gene's telling it to do, which is, in this instance, making viruses. So genes, as you may be aware, they are basically the recipe for, everything a cell does. So we have a certain hair color because of certain hair color genes, eye color because of eye color genes. Basically, everything that happens in a cell, or the majority of it anyway, that can be traced back to genes, and they produce proteins. And we'll come back to proteins in a moment. The key thing here is that the genes, in this instance, are the virus genes, and they're coding for the virus proteins. The cell, it can't tell the difference between the two. It just sees DNA or RNA, and it does what it's being told to do very obediently. It makes virus protein, or in other words, it makes more virus. Eventually, the cell gets so full of virus that it simply pops open. The virus bursts out through the cell is destroyed, and the viruses can spread to other cells in the immediate vicinity and potentially to further afield if it gets into the bloodstream or something like that. Now, this raises the question of what can we actually do against viruses? Like we mentioned before, they aren't bacteria, so antibiotics don't work against them. And there aren't an awful lot of medicines that do, really. Some of them can slow them down. Some of them can stop them taking hold in the first place. But once somebody has a virus infection, we're mainly reliant on the immune system to get rid of it. Now, the immune system, this is our body's own defense system, basically. It finds things which shouldn't be there, and it gets rid of them, destroys them, basically. And there's a couple of ways of doing this. But the key thing that has to happen is that it has to detect these proteins. So we mentioned earlier that the genes are coding for proteins, and the cell, because that's constantly producing protein, that is going to be putting things on the very outside of the cell in order to show the immune system what's going on inside the cell. So when it makes a protein, it basically waves a flag outside the cell, as we've shown with these red flags here. Now, if there's nothing wrong with it, if it's just a normal protein that the cell should be making anyway, then the immune system is going to ignore it, as we see on the right. There's nothing there to detect anything that isn't self anyway, and so the immune system just goes straight by it. The immune system doesn't care. It recognizes all the proteins as your own proteins, completely ignores them. When a cell is infected with a virus, however, it's making a protein which shouldn't be there. So when it waves some of these proteins outside the cell, just to show what's going on inside the cell, the immune system can see that they shouldn't be there. And now the immune system knows that there's a virus, basically in the body. And what it does next can be divided into two main groups as far as we're concerned. There are a few other things that can happen, but none that we really need to focus on today. Okay, so one of the things that the immune system can do is that it can eat up the viruses, basically. So as the viruses are going around, let's say in the bloodstream or just floating around all over the place, they will get eaten up by cells. And when I say eaten up, I do mean in a quite literal sense, really. These cells come along, they basically swallow them, basically fold themselves around the viruses, and eventually digest them. So that gets rid of the virus that way. However, this only works for viruses which aren't within cells already. Once a virus is inside a cell, the immune system can't do anything about that virus specifically, at least not very easily. What it can do instead, though, is that it can kill the cell which is actually producing the virus. Now, this may seem a little counterintuitive or a little pointless, perhaps. So why, if the entire issue is that a virus gets inside the cell and eventually kills it off, why does the immune system want to actually kill the body's own cells? This is because that cell is as good as dead anyway. So whilst it's producing virus, it's only making the problem worse. So the immune system comes along, kills off the cells which are waving those red flags out the window, basically, and that at the very least stops any more virus being produced, at least by that cell. And any virus that does get out, that can then be mopped up by those cells we mentioned earlier, which eat them up. So basically, two main ways that the immune system deals with viruses: killing the cells infected with them, and basically eating them up before they can infect any cells. Now, this raises the question of why do we ever get ill with viruses then? So why does the immune system not do this straight away? The reason for this is because the immune system has to learn how. The very first time it recognizes something that shouldn't be there, it has to make lots more cells in order to basically have the numbers to fight off this infection. The single cell that detects it, or the few cells that detect it, they can't do an awful lot in and of themselves. They have to make many, many, many more cells, and these cells are the ones which are basically going to go and fight off the virus, the things that we looked at earlier. Now, the issue with this is that it takes a while. It can take days, it can take potentially weeks. Now, for some viruses, let's say the common cold, that's not a huge deal really. You have maybe a bit of a sniffle for a few days, and then your immune system fights it off, and then you get better. For something more serious like COVID-19, however, this can have very serious consequences, because whilst your immune system is learning to fight off the virus numbers are increasing as well, and it's having very serious effects. Now, unfortunately, it may be that it just simply takes too long, that the immune system can't fight it off in the end, and that can sadly be fatal, of course. But even if somebody does survive it, the damage may be permanent, or at the very least long lasting. So this is why we have diseases like long COVID, which you may have heard of now. So basically the symptoms of COVID-19, not the primary ones, but things like tiredness, the lack of taste and smell, perhaps, things like that. It's not fully understood just yet, but a lot of these symptoms can last quite a while. Now, this is why the immune system is a little bit limited in this regard. Theoretically, the immune system is able to destroy any virus the second it comes, well, not the second it comes along, of course, but very rapidly as it appears. The big issue, however, is that it simply doesn't know to. It doesn't know how to. It has to see the protein from the virus first, realize that it has to kill off anything with that protein, and that's going to take a little while. And whilst that's happening, the virus is having its effects. Now, at least if somebody does survive the first infection, the second time, because the immune system has now learnt to fight it off, the second infection either doesn't result in the disease, or it will be much milder. Now, this varies a lot between different diseases. So something like chicken pox, for instance, you may have as a child and then never have again throughout your entire life. Some diseases, the immunity will wear off after a while. We don't know exactly what it's going to be like for COVID-19, but fundamentally, once you've had a disease once, in principle, it should be much more difficult to get it later on. And if you do get it, it should be milder. So this raises the question of, can we basically make this happen the first time around? Can we warn the immune system in advance? And the answer is yes, we can. And this is vaccination. Now, vaccination, this in its modern form goes back to around 1796. So as some people may be aware of already, Edward Jenner, he basically created, or rather modernized the smallpox vaccine. So it was known at the time that people who had had cowpox, so milkmaids predominantly, they weren't getting smallpox. Now, smallpox was a very serious issue at the time. It's well, it's a very deadly disease. It affects children, it affects adults, it can affect an awful lot of people. And like I say, it can be fatal. So naturally, smallpox was something that people would want to avoid, of course. And it was known, not just to Jenner, but to the people well, who were getting cowpox, that the people who did get cowpox, they simply didn't get smallpox. Now, this made him realize that we could theoretically give people cowpox, and then they weren't going to get smallpox after that. Now, cowpox, this is a much milder disease than smallpox. It still produces symptoms, but they are much milder, much less fatal than smallpox symptoms would be. So of the two, people would probably rather have had cowpox, basically. So what he did was he inoculated a 13-year-old boy with something, well, the vaccinia virus, the cowpox virus. And this is where the term vaccine comes from. He later on tried to give him the smallpox virus and see if he developed smallpox. Now, naturally, anybody doing that today would get a stern talking to from an ethics committee at the very least, of course, but fortunately for the boy, he lived. They were correct. Cowpox, protected against smallpox. And now this was one of the first instances of using one disease to prevent another. So this is what, let's say that was the first vaccination, basically. However, it wasn't the first time that the general concept had been used. So it'd been used for 1,000 years or so, that, again with smallpox, in fact, that if somebody were to inhale the scabs of somebody who had had smallpox. So basically take the smallpox scabs off, let them dry out, grind it into dust, inhale it. Then they would get smallpox, but it would be much milder. And this this process is generally called inoculation, basically giving somebody a disease so that they, at the very least, don't get the full-blown disease later on. And this was done with smallpox for quite some time. So, like I say, 1,000 years ago, it was done with the scabs, and this was done mainly in China. Over in Europe, North Africa, a similar approach was used a few hundred years later, but this was using, let's say, the pus from those scabs. But the general concept was the same. By giving somebody the disease, they prevented the full-blown version taking effect. So why am I telling you all this? The reason is because like I say, the general concept is the same behind them. So when somebody is given the protein of a virus or anything else that could infect them, the immune system recognize it as if they were actually having the infection themselves. So in the case of the early inoculations, the person may well have been infected with smallpox, but it was a very low dose of it. And there were lots of basically dead virus within it. And so the immune system learned to fight off the virus without having to actually have a full-blown infection. In the case of vaccination, protecting against smallpox using cowpox, the general concept is still the same because of the fact that cowpox and smallpox are related to one another. The immune system basically can't tell the difference between the two. So it sees cowpox, it learns to fight that off, then it sees smallpox a little later on. As far as it's concerned, they're one and the same. So it destroys the smallpox infected cells and it destroys the smallpox virus as if it had already seen it, because as far as it's concerned, it has. It's seen something similar enough. Okay then, so the key concept behind vaccination in general is that when you induce this, let's say, artificial first infection, so the immune system thinks it's being infected, and to some extent it may well be, especially in inoculation and vaccination for a different disease, in the early ones anyway. The immune system, that builds up its numbers exactly like it would have done if it was, let's say, a real first infection. However, there's no virus there which is going to develop, at least in modern vaccines, because the virus is either dead or it's not viable long term, or at the very least it's just harmless. So as a result, we only get the immune response building up. So that's the only side which gains strength, basically. So when we do end up getting infected, the virus is destroyed much more rapidly. It's as if it's that second infection that we spoke about earlier. The immune system detects the virus for the first time, but as far as it's concerned, it's seen it before, it already knows how to fight it off, and so indeed it does. This means that the disease either doesn't take hold, or at the very least it's going to be milder. Okay then, so that's all a little bit about vaccines in general. So what about these current vaccines, some of which are brand new, never really been used clinically before? So there's a few different types. We'll go through a couple of the major ones, especially those that are being used in the UK, as well as a few other possibilities that are currently being trialed. So the general, like I say, the general concept behind vaccination is showing a protein to the immune system. It's showing that red flag to the immune system. And especially in the early days, this generally took the form of putting a virus in the body, or a dead virus, or proteins from that virus. Basically, one way or another, it's taking the proteins, whether attached to a virus or not, and putting them inside the body so that the immune system can just see it directly. Now, that works for a lot of diseases, but it doesn't work for every single one. So alternative types of vaccines were needed. So in the UK, we have got two different types of vaccines being used now to fight off COVID. So one of them is using mRNA. So you may well have heard of the mRNA vaccines, a new type of vaccine. Now, mRNA is very similar to DNA in that it codes for a protein, basically. The difference is that mRNA is a temporary copy of that DNA. So we'll go over all that in a moment, but the key thing is that we're basically giving the cell instructions to make a protein rather than giving it the protein directly. Another method is to use a virus to actually deliver the DNA or the RNA like the coronavirus itself did in the first place. Now, this may sound a little strange, but it's done using a virus which is safe. Basically, it's one which can't replicate, one which can't make more virus. So it technically infects the cell, and we're doing that deliberately. And in doing so, it's delivering DNA, delivering genetic material into that cell. So now the cell has got the genes to make a certain protein. Now, this isn't just a virus that that they've taken a swab of something from somewhere, let's say. This is a specifically manufactured virus. So we've had its own genetic material removed. We've put new genetic material inside, the genetic material that we actually want to get inside the cell. And we basically hijack that virus, this harmless virus, and use it to inject the DNA into the cells or the RNA into the cells. So basically, very similar in concept to the mRNA vaccines, which is that we're delivering the instructions to make the proteins rather than the proteins itself. As for some other possibilities, some of them are currently used in places like the US, some of them are currently still in trials, but the general point behind them, at least the major possibilities, is by a more conventional type of virus vaccine. So either by using dead or inactive coronavirus, or by just taking the COVID-19 proteins and adding them in relatively directly. Okay, so we mentioned that we'd have a little bit of a chat about what mRNA actually is. So I've mentioned that mRNA is basically the instructions to make a protein. Now, how is that different to DNA then? So I know that we're going to have a range of knowledge here about genetics and stuff like that. So we'll just run through the basics, run through the outline of it. Now, DNA, this is inside all of our cells pretty much, and every cell has pretty much identical DNA. Now, every cell is different though, because not all cells are using all of their DNA at the same time. Sometimes some DNA is switched off, sometimes some DNA is actually being read. And the DNA which is being read, that is the DNA which is making the mRNA, the messenger RNA it's called. Now, I tend to imagine this as a bit like a recipe book. So if your DNA is a recipe book, you've got the recipes for starters, main course, dessert, from pretty much anything you could want, let's say. Now, you're not going to be making everything at the same time, of course. You're only going to be making certain things. So whenever you want to make something, you read the book, you find the ingredients that you need, and you write a shopping list for it. So to bring that back down to DNA, you make mRNA, basically a message that's basically a copy of part of the book, part of the DNA. Now, later on, you then go to the shops and buy the ingredient, and that will be equivalent to the mRNA coding for the protein specifically. So the cell reads the mRNA and makes the protein. So the basic overview is that DNA, that's in the cells all the time. The mRNA, this is produced when the DNA is basically being switched on, when the recipe is being read, let's say. That mRNA goes to another part of the cell, and then this makes the protein, basically the machinery of cells, or as far as we're concerned here, the part of the virus which the cell is basically going to wave out the window as that red flag. Sorry. Now, we can take advantage of this because we can basically sneak something onto the shopping list. So maybe write ice cream or something on when mom's not looking. So we can take some mRNA for part of the coronavirus, part of SARS-CoV-2. Not a dangerous part, literally just some piece of the structure of it. Now, this piece of structure, this is totally harmless in and of itself. It can't do anything. It can't give you the disease. It can't like we just can't do anything really. So it's kind of like the difference between a car and a wing mirror. Your wing mirror can't drive down the M6 any more than the protein from the mRNA is going to give you coronavirus or COVID, sorry. So the mRNA, that sneaks into the cell, and then the cell, again, it just sees this and does what it always does with the mRNA and makes the protein. So the general concept here is that we give it mRNA, which codes for part of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Again, a harmless version. The cell makes that protein, waves it out the window again. The immune system sees it, and it can then learn to destroy it. So it sees it, it knows it shouldn't be there, and so it prepares to destroy anything which has that protein. Now, when the actual if the actual SARS-CoV-2 virus does come along, then it's therefore ready to fight it off as if it had already been infected with it. Now, using a virus, like I said earlier, is very similar, except that instead of putting the mRNA in directly, we use a virus to basically deliver it for us. Now, again, this is a different virus to SARS-CoV-2. It's a harmless one. It can't replicate. It's simply a tool to inject genetic material inside a cell. And so indeed it does. And the cell makes the protein then. It makes the protein associated with COVID-19. The immune system detects it, and it prepares to fight off anything which has this protein, so that when the if or when the actual virus does come along, the immune system can destroy it relatively rapidly, again, as if it had already seen it, because it has. Okay, so this applies to basically any kind of vaccine where the protein is being produced by the cell. It's being shown off by the cell, the immune system detects it and prepares to fight off anything that has that protein. Other types of vaccination where those proteins are given much more directly, let's say, they work in a similar way. It's just that they're generally going to be free floating rather than on cells. Not necessarily, but generally speaking. So as a result, we end up with this sort of thing happening again. The cells on the left, they eat up these viruses that are floating around all over the place. Similarly, just the circulating immune cells, they will find the cells which are expressing the coronavirus proteins and kill it off. So this, I should stress, is that what we're representing here is when the virus actually does come along. The immune system is already ready to fight it off, ready to kill it off, because as far as it's concerned, it's already seen it. It already knows how to. It already knows that this is a problem in my face, and so it's already prepared to fight the virus off. So that just about brings us to the end of our talk for today. So thank you all for listening this far. We'll just have a little bit of a sum up of all the key points. Basically, the immune system can kill off viruses as well as other types of infectious disease, but it just takes a little bit of time to learn how to. That is a problem, especially for fairly serious diseases like COVID-19. So what we can do instead is that we can warn them in advance. We can tell them that this is coming. We can show them what it looks like. They're going to prepare, and then they are ready to fight off that disease. Sorry, excuse me. Now, so there's a few different types, of course, but the key thing is that we're showing off a protein to the immune system, a protein of COVID-19, basically. Now, it may be that we tell the cells how to make it. This is how the vaccines in the UK generally work, or we may add the protein much more directly, whether it's just purified protein, let's say, or protein samples, or just dead or inactive virus. Okay, so I think that's just about the end. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and thanks a lot for having me today.
Perfect. That's great. Thank you, Dylan. That was really, really interesting. So thank you for going over that for us. I definitely feel like I've learned a lot more about it, and just kind of, I guess, reassuring when you just understand it a bit more.
Thank you.
So thank you for everyone for coming today. Definitely pop in any questions you have. about what Dylan's just gone over with vaccines and the history. We have got 1 and 2 coming in. So we've got the first one here, Dylan. How do vaccinations cause side effects? I've heard some reports of bad side effects with one of the COVID vaccines, but not the other. Is there a reason for this being different?
So that's a good question, and I know that this is something that concerns a lot of people. Now, there's a few different types of side effects that can come from vaccines or from any medical intervention in general, really. Now, with vaccines specifically, part of the problem is that they are inducing an immune response. Now, the immune system realizes that something is wrong. Basically, it realizes that there's something there that shouldn't be. Now, we're doing that deliberately, of course. We're basically warning it that something like this may come along. The problem there is that the immune system doesn't know that. It doesn't know that it's a drill. It knows that there's something there that shouldn't be. And in addition to making these preparations, it does some other things as well. Basically, other things to try and kill off a virus which isn't actually there. So this is why things like aches and pains, fever, stuff like that, these are part of the body's way of defending itself against infection. Basically trying to kill it off, trying to make you rest so that it basically can dedicate energy to it, that sort of thing. So sometimes vaccines can cause symptoms of infection because what we actually think of symptoms of infection are actually symptoms of the immune response. So this is why there's some general side effects associated with vaccines. Now, I know that there are some reports of more serious side effects. So one of them in particular, I think, is the recent blood clotting issue. Now, I think in this instance, it's worth mentioning that nobody knows for certain just yet. The reports are still ongoing. However, it's only been observed that people have had the vaccine and then later developed these blood clots, as far as I'm aware. Now, the numbers, this is incredibly low numbers of people who report this. So at worst case scenario, the vaccine doesn't seem to be causing it in anywhere near anything near a worrying population, let's say. However, it is also worth mentioning that if you take a random person, just pick a name from a hat, see where they are a day or two later, there's a chance that they'll have had a blood clot. Now, if you just do that with one random person, that of course is going to be very unlikely to happen. If you do it with millions of them, and of course millions of people have been vaccinated, you're going to get quite a few who do get these blood clots. And the numbers so far, at least, don't seem so far off from what we would expect if we just picked people at random. So it may be that the vaccine is increasing the possibility of that happening, but at least so far, it either seems that it's a small increase, but offset by the benefits of not getting the disease potentially, or at the very least being less likely to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a key thing, really, is I think when they were talking about potential side effects, I don't think that was one that particularly came up. So I think it's kind of the unknown, isn't it, of what could happen. Fantastic. Perfect. We've got another question here. So does this have any adverse effect on the DNA?
That's a really good one. Now, basically, none that is known, let's say. Now, I don't want to say anything absolutely definitively because the answer realistically is going to be no, but there's always that 1 in a million chance that something a bit weird can happen. Now, well, not 1 in a million, 1 in a few billion realistically. But anyway, the point is that the RNA, the DNA that's being used by the virus, whether it's for the vaccine or the virus itself, that is very far away from the DNA of your own cells. So the DNA of our cells, that's in something called the nucleus, basically almost like a cell within a cell. It's got its own skin around it, basically. It's locked away. Now, we can put DNA or RNA inside a cell, and it's just going to be floating around freely, and eventually it's just going to disappear. Now, the mRNA vaccines, they are coming from, or rather, mRNA in general is coming from DNA. It can't go back into DNA or anything like that. So kind of like your shopping list isn't going to find itself being written back in the recipe book, the mRNA isn't going to get back inside the DNA. Now, like I say, the reason that I'm hesitant to give a massively definitive answer there is almost just like general scientific hesitance, because it's not something which can realistically be conclusively demonstrated empirically in a lab. All we can really say is that there's no reason that it should do. There's no hypothetical way that it could. So long as we're injecting RNA, there's no apparent mechanism by which that can get back into DNA. I know that there are general stuff going around Facebook, stuff like that, really. There are enzymes which can make DNA from RNA, but even if they could, that DNA, that's still going to be outside the nucleus. It may just not end up getting into the nucleus at all. Similarly, those enzymes are very rare. They're in very specific circumstances. It isn't something like in all the cells. Sorry, so just a couple of last things on that point. It's also worth mentioning that that even if the RNA we injected into the body did somehow get into the DNA, then there almost certainly wouldn't actually be any effect of that. Now, one outcome is that the cell therefore keeps making this virus protein, and so it gets destroyed by the immune system. Therefore, the issue is gone, basically. Otherwise, it's just going to get inside that cell. Even if it doesn't make the protein, then that cell most likely is going to die off relatively soon anyway, because cells are constantly being turned over. So I know that I'm probably going quite in depth here, a few different possibilities, and I apologize for that. So just one thing to finish up with is that I think generally when we talk about our DNA, we imagine like like a single recipe book, but really what we actually have is every cell has its own recipe book. So what we do to one cell isn't going to do anything to any of the other cells. So even if the DNA got totally obliterated in one cell, let's say, that cell just gets destroyed, and that's no big loss because cells are constantly destroyed and rebuilt all the time.
That's great. Thank you, Dylan. I think that's really informative. I think the key thing there as well, wasn't it? It's kind of, there is always, I guess, the slight bit of the unknown as we've learned in this past year, but I think it's also taught us a massive amount as well at the same time. And that's it. We've got a couple more questions come in. So this person's asked, how do we reduce the side effects of the vaccination? Is that
okay? So that's a good question. Yeah. So the side effects. So if this is just a general, let's say, immune response type of side effect, so pain, fever, stuff like that, then as a general concept, I would just say stuff like, let's say paracetamol, even just general over-the-counter medication like that. That's the kind of things that would generally be advised. Now, like I say, I can't give medical advice, of course, and I don't know if that's appropriate for any given vaccine. So that should be something to talk about with whoever's giving you the vaccination as you have it. But in principle, there's not an awful lot that we would need to worry about in terms of making the vaccines have less side effects in general, just in terms of giving it to people wide scale, simply because, these are largely unavoidable. They can be treated with basically symptomatically if need be.
Fantastic. Thank you. Perfect. And we have another question here. So, are there particular risks to pregnant women, and can it cause problems with the development of the placenta?
So the perhaps not massively useful answer there is that I do not know for certain. And part of the reason for that is that, basically nobody does. Now, there's a bit of medical history to this answer as well, of course. So as some people may be aware, it was discovered a few years back that there were medicines which were perfectly fine for adults to take, and it eventually turned out that they were causing problems for unborn babies. And ever since then, most medicines, including vaccinations, they aren't automatically cleared for use in pregnancy. So there's always a bit of a question mark, like you say, simply because the ethics of testing something on pregnant humans, that's a little more difficult, because then you have the issue of potentially what's a fetus who can't consent. It may end up with consequences, stuff like that. But this is all about medical testing in general, really. There have been some cases of giving it to pregnant women. I'm not aware of any problems associated with it, but this is just the reason for the general hesitance. People, so medics, scientists, they don't want to give medicines to to pregnant people, generally speaking, unless they know for certain that it's going to be safe, because sometimes there's unintended effects. So what I can say is that there's not much in theory why it would be a problem, and I do know that it is being used in practice, and there's no reports of problems yet that I'm aware of. But beyond that, I can't really give a definitive answer, unfortunately.
No, I think that's really great. Thank you, Dylan. I think just kind of understanding a bit more, obviously, about, there is that, again, that unknown, isn't there? And very, kind of saying that it's who's consenting, and obviously not wanting to risk something that's obviously very important. Fantastic. I think that is all of our questions answered this evening, which is really great. Just kind of thank you to everyone for joining us today, and especially thank you to Dylan. Oh, apologies. No, we've got one more that's just come in. If you've got the time, Dylan, we'll just do this last one, and then it is, if the contents of these vaccines are almost the same, why is the efficiency different?
So that is a really good question as well. So part of the answer is, again, unfortunately, going to be that we don't know for certain. We don't know exactly why one vaccine would necessarily be more effective than another. What we do know, though, is that they are being delivered in different ways. So basically being delivered into different cells in different ways. Now, it may be that some people's cells, they will take up the mRNA quite easily, whereas other people's cells may take up the virus vector, the virally delivered form, more easily. So it's potentially likely to be that it's more to do with how the vaccine gets into the cells rather than the vaccine in and of itself. Not necessarily, but that would probably be one of the major causes of the difference, because basically, because the messages has to get inside the cell, there's going to be differences in how effective that is in different people, as well as how effective each different version is. So it may be that one simply gets into the cells more easily than another, and so the other one just is less likely to make that protein or much of it in the first place for the immune system to detect. It may also be that the protein that they're actually putting into them, or rather the protein being coded for, it may be that one of them is simply a more effective target, but that I don't know quite so much about, unfortunately. I don't think that's been as rigorously tested just yet.
No, thank you just for doing that last one, Dylan. Hopefully that does answer that question. Like you say, we're kind of learning every day from this, aren't we? So I imagine this kind of talk in a year's time could be very different, and there might be many things that we've learned from sort of the rollouts of the various ones coming forward. Perfect. So yeah, again, thank you for joining us this evening, everyone. Hopefully you found it as informative as I have. And really enjoyed hearing more from Dylan, and also thank you to Dylan just for putting this talk on for everyone. Yeah, have a nice evening, everyone.
Thank you very much, all of you.
Perfect. Thank you again, Dylan.
Thanks a lot.
Have a nice evening.
You too. Bye now.